Welcome to Lady Mythos.
There is a story from the ancient Persian epic, the Shahnameh, written by Ferdowsi, that doesn't feel like a myth at all. A father and a son stand on opposite sides of a battlefield without knowing who they are to each other. They've never met, they've never spoken, but everything in their lives has been leading them to this moment. And what makes this story difficult to watch is this. There were chances, real chances, where this could have been stopped. A name could have been spoken. A truth could have been revealed. One honest answer could have changed everything. But none of it happened. And now, they are about to face each other. This is the story of Rostam and Sohrab from Persian mythology, told in the Shahnameh. A story about strength, silence, and a question that comes too late. So the question that follows this story is simple, but it carries everything. Will they recognize each other before it's too late? If you've already followed the journey of Rostam, linked above, especially his 7 trials, where he faced demons, darkness, and forces no man should survive, then you already know the kind of warrior he is. Unmatched, unbreakable, almost untouchable. But this story, this is not about the battles he won. This is about the one he should have never fought. If you enjoy immersive myth storytelling like this, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find these stories. And if you'd like to support the channel and follow more stories like this, consider subscribing. Now, we go back to where this all begins. Not on a battlefield, not in a war, but in a quiet land, far from where Rostam belonged. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. Chapter 1. The son who was never meant to be found. Rostam did not enter the land of Samangan as a man expecting his life to change. He came, as he often did, alone, confident, moving through unfamiliar territory with the same certainty that had carried him through countless dangers before. The ground was dry beneath his horse's hooves, the air still. The kind of silence that feels harmless until it isn't. By his side was Raksh. Not just a horse, but a companion that had carried him through battles most men wouldn't survive. Strong, loyal, almost as legendary as Rostam himself. And that night, Rostam slept without concern. That was the first mistake, because when he woke, Raksh was gone. Not wandered. Not lost, taken. For a man like Rostam, this wasn't just theft, it was a challenge. There are stories of warriors who lose weapons, armor, even kingdoms. But losing Raksh was different. It was personal. So he followed the trail, through dust, through scattered tracks, until it led him to the gates of Samangan. The king of that land welcomed him carefully, respectfully, but with a certain tension that lingered beneath the surface. Because even here, Rostam's name carried weight. Servants were sent, searches were ordered, and soon enough, Raksh was found, returned. The problem, at least on the surface, was solved. But the story didn't end there, because that night, something else began. The palace grew quiet as darkness settled over the land. Torches burned low against stone walls. Shadows stretched across long corridors. The kind of stillness where even footsteps seem louder than they should. Rostam rested, unaware that someone had already made a decision about him. Princess Tamina had heard of him long before he arrived. Stories travel fast when they carry the name of a man like Rostam, a warrior who had faced monsters, a man who had crossed lands no one else dared to enter, a name tied to strength, to legend, to something larger than life. But Tamina wasn't drawn to the stories the way others were. She wasn't interested in glory. She saw something else, opportunity. And that decision would come back later. That night, while the palace slept, she moved quietly through its halls. No hesitation, no second thoughts. She knew exactly where she was going. When she entered Rostam's chamber, there was no fear in her voice, no uncertainty. She spoke directly, clearly. She told him why she had come, not for affection, not for companionship, but for a purpose that felt almost unsettling in its certainty. She wanted a child. Not just any child. His child. A son who would carry his strength forward into the world. Rostam listened. And this is where something subtle happens in the story. Because he does not question her the way you might expect. He does not hesitate long. Whether it was confidence or simply the nature of the moment, he agrees. No promises are made beyond that night. No future is planned. Just a single choice. And in the quiet hours before dawn, that choice is made real. Morning comes quickly, too quickly. Because unlike the weight of what had just happened, the world outside continues as if nothing has changed. Raksh is ready. The road calls. And Rostam prepares to leave. Before he goes, Tamina stands before him one last time. There is no regret in her expression, no doubt, only something quiet, controlled, as if she already understands the path ahead more clearly than he does. And then Rostam does something small. Something that, at the time, means very little. He gives her a token, a seal, a simple object, easy to overlook, easy to forget. But its purpose is clear. If a child is born, this will be the proof. This will be the link. This will be the one thing that could connect them again. And then he leaves. No turning back, no looking behind him. Just another journey, like all the others before. But here's the part no one expected. That small moment, quiet, almost forgettable, would become the center of everything that follows. Because somewhere behind those palace walls, a child would be born. A child who would grow up asking one question again and again. Who is my father? And the answer to that question would change the fate of both of them. Just not in the way anyone would have wanted. Chapter 2. A child raised for war. The child was born in silence. No great announcement, no celebration carried across the land. Only the quiet walls of Samangan, and a mother who already understood that this child would not live an ordinary life. Tamina held him close in those first moments, small, still, breathing softly. But even then, there was something unsettling about the calm, because she knew who his father was, and more importantly, she knew what that meant. This was not just a child. This was the son of Rostam. Time moved quickly after that, faster than it should have. The boy did not grow like other children. Strength came early, too early. By the time he could stand, his grip was already firm enough to startle those around him. Servants would exchange quiet glances. Guards would watch him longer than necessary. And as the years passed, those glances turned into whispers. Because Sohrab was not just strong, he was overwhelming. There are moments described in the Shahnameh where his presence alone feels heavy, like something larger than his age, something that didn't quite belong among ordinary people. By the time he reached childhood, there was no doubt left. He could wrestle grown men to the ground. He could handle weapons that others struggled to lift. His movements were not learned, they were instinctive. Tamina noticed something else, something that worried her more than his strength. Because every display of strength brought with it the same question. How long before he asked? It didn't take long. Children noticed differences early. Other boys spoke of their fathers, warriors, nobles, men they trained with or looked up to. Sohrab had none of that, only silence. At first the questions were simple. Where is my father? Who is he? Tamina would answer, but never fully. She told him enough to shape his thoughts, but not enough to reveal the truth. She spoke of a great warrior, a man unmatched in strength, a figure known across lands. And as she described him, something changed in Sohrab. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It became something sharper, a pull, a need to understand where he came from. But here's the part no one expected. Tamina made a decision in that moment that would shape everything that followed. She chose not to tell him the name. It wasn't out of doubt. She knew exactly who his father was. But she also understood the world beyond Samangan. She knew the fragile balance between Iran and Turan. She knew the tensions that could turn into war without warning. And deep down, she feared something very specific. If Sohrab ever learned too early that his father was Rostam, the greatest champion of Iran, then one day he might try to find him. And if that day came during a time of conflict, they would not meet as father and son. They would meet as enemies. That possibility was enough. So she kept the truth buried, not erased, hidden. That choice didn't feel dangerous at the time. It would become one. Instead, she gave him something else, a direction, a purpose that felt close to the truth, but not quite there. She told him that his father was great, that if he wanted to understand him, he would have to become great as well. Not through comfort, not through ease, but through strength, through training, through becoming something the world could not ignore. And Sohrab accepted that, not reluctantly, eagerly. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Training began early, not as a formality, but as necessity. Weapons were placed in his hands long before most would consider it appropriate. Wooden at first, then iron. He learned to move with weight, to strike with control, to stand without fear. But what made it different was how quickly he surpassed everyone around him. Men who trained him found themselves struggling to keep up. Techniques meant to guide him became things he adapted, reshaped, improved. There was no gradual climb, only acceleration. And with every passing year, the idea of his father grew larger in his mind. He began to imagine him, not as a distant figure, but as someone real, someone powerful, someone out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. And slowly, that thought began to change. It wasn't enough anymore to simply know who his father was. He wanted to meet him, to stand beside him, to prove something, not just to the world, but to himself. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. Because that desire, it didn't stay personal. It became something much bigger. The stories of kings and kingdoms reached him next. Of Iran, of Turan, of rulers who held power over lands divided by conflict. And in Sohrab's mind, a new idea began to form. If he could rise high enough, if he could gather enough strength, he could change the order of the world itself. He could find his father, place him where he belonged, and stand beside him not as a child, but as an equal. It sounds like ambition, but underneath it, there was something else. A gap, an absence, a missing truth shaping every decision he made. Tahmina saw it happening. Not all at once, but slowly, over time. The questions became less frequent, but more intense. The training became harsher. The silence between them heavier. Because even without knowing the truth, Sohrab was already moving toward it. And there was nothing she could do to stop that. Somewhere far from Samangan, Rostam continued his life. Unaware, unchanged. The battles he fought, the victories he claimed, none of them touched this part of the story. Because he did not know. Not about the child, not about the decision that had been made, not about the path already forming. And what he didn't realize yet was that everything was already in motion. Sohrab was no longer just a child. He was becoming something else. Something the world would soon have to face. And the closer he moved toward that future, the smaller the distance became between him and the man he had been searching for all along. Chapter 3. The Name That Was Never Spoken. By the time Sohrab reached his youth, the questions had changed. He no longer asked them like a child. There was no impatience in his voice, no frustration. Only something quieter, more focused. He would sit with Tahmina in the evenings when the light had faded and the world felt still, and ask again. Not who his father was, but why he had never come. And that question was harder to answer. The palace felt different now. Where once it had been a place of quiet protection, it now carried a sense of waiting. Servants moved carefully around him. Guards watched him with a kind of unease they couldn't hide. Because Sohrab was no longer just strong. He was becoming something people couldn't fully understand. And he knew it. Not in arrogance, but in awareness. He could feel the difference between himself and others, in the way they spoke to him, in the way they stepped aside, in the way silence followed him into a room. And naturally, his thoughts returned to the same place. If he was like this, then what must his father be? Amina saw the change clearly. Every question now carried weight. Every silence stretched longer than before. And she understood something that could no longer be ignored. The truth she had hidden was no longer something she could simply protect him from. It was something shaping him, guiding him, even in its absence. But still, she did not speak the name. Instead, she gave him fragments, carefully chosen. She told him that his father was not just a warrior, but a man known across kingdoms. That kings respected him, that enemies feared him, that his strength was unmatched. And as she spoke, Sohrab listened differently now. Not as a child imagining stories, but as someone building a picture, piece by piece. And in that picture, one idea began to take hold. If such a man existed, then why was he absent? But here's the part no one expected. Sohrab did not grow resentful. He did not turn that absence into anger. He turned it into purpose. If his father was truly as great as she described, then there had to be a reason. A reason he had not returned. A reason he had not claimed him. And in Sohrab's mind, that reason could only be one thing. Distance. Not of land, but of power. He began to see the world differently after that. Not as separate kingdoms and distant rulers, but as something that could be changed. If power determined who stood where, then power could be taken, reordered, rebuilt. And at the center of that idea was his father. Still unnamed, still unseen, but no longer distant. He spoke less about finding him and more about rising, about becoming strong enough that the world itself would shift. Strong enough that whoever his father was, he would have no choice but to stand beside him. This is where things begin to shift in a way no one notices. Because that vision, it did not stay contained within him. Beyond the walls of Samangan, word had already begun to spread, not just of a strong young man, but of something unusual, a presence, a force growing quietly. And in lands where power was always being measured, that kind of story does not go unnoticed. Messengers came, not openly, not with declarations, but carefully, watching, listening, carrying whispers back to places where those whispers mattered. To Turan, to those who understood how to recognize strength and how to use it. Sohrab did not yet see the full picture. He only saw opportunity, a wider world, a path beyond the place walls, a chance to step into something greater than himself. But what he didn't realize yet was that others were already shaping that path for him. Quietly, patiently. Tamina felt it before she saw it. A shift. Subtle, but undeniable. The world was beginning to reach toward her son. And for the first time, the decision she had made years ago began to feel unstable. Because the longer she kept the truth hidden, the less control she had over what would happen next. There were moments, brief, quiet moments, where she almost spoke it, almost said the name, Rostam. But each time, she stopped, because once spoken, it could not be taken back. And she feared not just the truth, but what Sohrab would do with it. So instead, the silence remained, heavy now, no longer protective, but dangerous. Sohrab stood at the edge of something he could not yet see, a path already forming beneath his feet, a future shaped not just by his strength, but by what had been kept from him. And the closer he moved forward, the closer he came to the one answer he had been searching for all his life. Chapter 4: The Young Giant of Turan. The first time Sohrab stepped beyond the borders of Samangan, the world did not feel unfamiliar. It felt expected, as if everything he had imagined, the scale of it, the tension, the distance between kingdoms, had always been waiting for him to arrive. The roads stretched long and dry beneath his feet. Caravans passed carrying news from distant lands. And everywhere he went, people noticed. Not because of what he said, but because of what he was. He did not travel quietly, even when he tried. Strength like his does not stay hidden. It shows in the way a man carries himself, in the way others step aside without being told, in the way silence follows him into unfamiliar spaces. And it wasn't long before that presence reached the ears of those who understood exactly what it meant. In Turan, the court of Afrasiab was not a place where strength went unnoticed. It was a place where strength was measured, weighed, and used. Sohrab was brought there not as a prisoner, and not quite as a guest. Something in between, observed, studied. The halls were vast, lined with stone and shadow. Torches burned steadily, casting long, unmoving light across the floor. Men stood in silence along the walls, warriors, advisors, figures who had seen enough conflict to recognize what stood before them. Because even without knowing his story, they could see it. This was not just a young man. This was something that could shift the balance of power. Sohrab did not bow the way others did, not out of disrespect, but because it did not come naturally to him. He stood, as he always had, direct, steady, unafraid. And Afrasiab watched him carefully, not with admiration, but with calculation. Questions were asked, Not about his childhood, not about where he had come from, but about what he wanted. And Sohrab answered simply. He spoke of strength, of rising, of changing the order of things. And then, something more specific. He spoke of his father, a man he had never met, a warrior greater than all others, a man he intended to find. There was a pause in the room after that. Not long, but enough, because Afrasiab understood something immediately. This was not just strength. This was direction. And direction could be shaped. But here's the part no one expected. Afrasiab did not try to stop him. He encouraged him. He did not reveal what he knew. He did not speak the name that could have changed everything. Instead, he allowed Sohrab's belief to grow. Carefully, quietly. Because a young warrior searching for his father could be guided toward something else entirely. The conflict between Iran and Turan had never truly ended. It lingered beneath everything, in borders, in memory, in the quiet readiness of armies that never fully stood down. And Afrasiab saw an opportunity in that. He offered Sohrab what he needed: an army. Not as a gift, as a path. If Sohrab wanted to find his father, if he wanted to rise high enough that the world itself would answer him, then there was only one place to begin: Iran. The logic was simple, clear, and dangerous. If his father was truly the greatest warrior alive, then he would be there, at the center of power, at the heart of the conflict. Sohrab accepted, not because he was being used, but because it aligned perfectly with what he already believed, that he needed to move forward, to step into something greater, to force the world to reveal what it had kept hidden from him. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. Because the path placed in front of him was not leading him to his father, not in the way he imagined. Preparations began quickly. Tents rose across open land. Armor was forged and fitted. Weapons sharpened under flickering firelight. The sound of movement filled the air. Soldiers assembling, horses restless, commanders speaking in low, controlled tones. And at the center of it all, Sohrab. He did not command like a king, not yet, but men followed him, not out of duty, out of instinct, because strength like his does not need explanation. At night, the camp would quiet. Fires burned low. The wind moved softly through canvas and steel, and in those moments, when the noise faded, Sohrab's thoughts returned to the same place. Somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, his father was waiting. He believed that, not with doubt, with certainty. He imagined the meeting, not as strangers, but as something inevitable. Two forces finally standing side by side, understanding each other without needing words. He couldn't see it yet, was how close he already was. Because far beyond those camps, in the land he was preparing to enter, there was a man who had no idea this path even existed. A man who had lived his life through battles and victories, unaware that one of those battles was already coming for him. And with every step Sohrab took toward Iran, the distance between them closed. Quietly, unnoticed, unstoppable. Chapter 5. A war that should never have happened. Once Sohrab accepted the army of Turan, the story stopped being private. Up to this point, everything had still lived inside a smaller circle. A mother protecting a truth, a son trying to understand who he was, a young warrior imagining that somewhere ahead there was a father worthy of being found. But the moment troops began to gather around him, banners were raised and commanders started treating him as the center of a campaign. That quiet search turned into something far more dangerous. It became war. And not the kind that begins with hatred. That is what makes this part so unsettling. The war, moving toward Iran, was not born out of personal vengeance or some lifelong grudge inside Sohrab. He was not marching because he wanted to burn cities or destroy a people he had grown up despising. He was moving because he believed power had to be rearranged before truth could be reached. In his mind, this was the path that would finally lead him to the man whose absence had shaped his whole life. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because this was a war that should never have happened at all. The movement from Turan was no longer rumor. It was visible now. Dust rose from the roads beneath marching feet and horse hooves. Campfires spread across the dark like scattered embers. Armor flashed in the daylight. Standards moved in the wind. Messengers rode hard between outposts, carrying the same reports again and again. A young commander of enormous strength was approaching, and wherever he passed, resistance folded. The first serious shock came at the White Fortress. This was not some empty place on the edge of the world. It was an Iranian stronghold, guarded and defended, and it stood as one of the early barriers between Sohrab's army and deeper entry into Iranian land. Its commander was Hujir, a man tested in battle, not a reckless youth who would panic at the first sign of danger. But when Sohrab came against the fortress, the balance was obvious very quickly. He did not arrive like a cautious general. He came forward with the confidence of someone who had never yet found an equal. He challenged the defenders directly, and when Hujir rode out to meet him, the fight did not last long enough to restore anyone's confidence. Sohrab overpowered him and captured him alive. That detail matters. He did not simply slaughter everyone in front of him without thought. His strength was brutal, but it was not mindless. Again and again in this story, Sohrab moves like someone standing between two roles, part conqueror, part seeker. Even in war, there are moments when he looks less like a destroyer and more like a man trying to push through the world until it finally gives him the answer he wants. But here's the part no one expected. Even after taking the fortress commander alive, Sohrab still had no idea how close he was to the truth he had been chasing. Inside the fortress, another figure emerged, and for a moment the story shifted. This was Guldafarid, the warrior woman who armed herself and rode out against him. That moment is one of the most vivid in the tale because it interrupts the rhythm of straightforward conquest. The gates, the armor, the challenge, the shock of confrontation, and then the reveal that the fighter before Sohrab was not the man he assumed, but a woman who had entered battle anyway. It slows everything down, just long enough to show that Iran was not going to collapse quietly in front of him. Sohrab fought her too. And the scene carries a strange tension because it mixes admiration, distraction, pride, and warning all at once. Guldafarid does not defeat him, but she delays him, speaks to him, and gives voice to something important. She warns him about Rostam. That name enters the air here with real force. Not as a hidden thought in Tahmineh's chamber, and not as an unspoken hope in Sohrab's mind, but as the name of the one man whose arrival could change the shape of the war. Sohrab heard it, and like everything else tied to that name, it stirred something deeper than simple curiosity. He had never met Rostam. He did not yet know the truth in full, but the repeated weight of that name, always attached to unmatched strength and impossible victories, could not help pressing against the questions already alive inside him. This is where the central tension of the story tightens again. Every time Sohrab moves closer to the battlefield, he also moves closer to recognition, but never cleanly, never directly, never in time. News of the fortress spread fast to the court of Kavus in Iran. There is an important shift here, because the fear on the Iranian side was not just fear of invasion. Armies invade all the time in epic stories. Kings hear of raids, border clashes, and troop movements without the whole kingdom freezing in place. This was different, because every report about Sohrab carried the same unsettling detail. He was too young for what he could do. That unnerved people. A seasoned enemy could be understood. A known rival could be measured against old victories and old defeats. But a young warrior who threw experienced men aside, broke through defenses, and seemed only to be growing more dangerous with every step forward, created a different kind of fear. He felt like something new, and in stories like this, something new is often worse than something known. Kavus reacted the way rulers often do when faced with a threat they cannot personally meet. He turned to the one man who had solved impossible problems before, Rostam. And this is the moment that changes everything. Because until now, Rostam has been absent from the active movement of the story. He is the hidden father, the missing name, the man unknowingly standing at the center of another person's life. But once Iran begins calling for him, the two paths finally begin closing in on one another. The summons went out, and Give was sent to bring Rostam. That detail may sound simple, but it carries enormous weight. Iran does not casually call for Rostam. When he is summoned, it means the threat has crossed the line from troubling to dangerous. It means the court believes ordinary answers will fail. It means the story is moving toward a point where only the greatest champion in the land can stand in the gap. When Give reached him and delivered the message, Rostam did not rush immediately in a blaze of dramatic certainty. That would have been too easy, and it would not fit the emotional architecture of this tale. He delayed. He did not yet feel the urgency the court felt. He had lived through too many crises, too many royal panics, too many moments where kings trembled and expected him to clean up the consequences. And in one of the most painful, ironic turns in the whole story, Rostam spoke of his own son in Samangan as though that son was still distant from all this, still too young to matter in war. That moment should land hard when spoken aloud in the finished video, because the audience already understands what Rostam does not. The boy he imagines far away is no longer a boy. He is the very force now moving across the frontier toward Iran. Ferdowsi uses that gap in knowledge with incredible cruelty. He lets the listener stand inside the truth while the characters continue walking blindly toward disaster. What he didn't realize yet was that the war he was being asked to fight had already become personal long before his name was called. Back in the Turanian camp, Sohrab was moving with the same conviction as before, but the atmosphere around him had changed. He was no longer just the strong young commander everyone talked about in wonder. Now, he was the spear point of a real invasion. His soldiers looked to him for direction. Fires burned late into the night. Horses stamped in the darkness. Armor was mended, tightened, checked again under wavering torchlight. Voices dropped lower as they moved from boast to strategy. And somewhere inside all that noise, the same questions still lived in him. Not spoken every hour, not repeated like a child's refrain, but there, steady. Who is my father? And where in this world does he stand? That is the quiet engine under everything Sohrab does. It is what keeps him from feeling like a simple conqueror. His campaign is violent, yes, but it is also haunted. The search has never ended. It has only changed shape. And that is what makes the next stage unbearable. Because the closer Iran comes to calling Rostam, the closer Sohrab comes to the answer. But every person between them, every court calculation, every withheld truth, every delay, keeps nudging the story toward the worst possible form of recognition. Not reunion, not rescue. Recognition after damage. Recognition after blood. Recognition too late. By the end of this chapter, the lines are fully drawn. Turan is advancing. Iran is alarmed. The White Fortress has fallen into the flow of war. Ghorda Farid has spoken Rostam's name into the story with new force. Kekavus has sent for the one man he trusts to stop the advance. Rostam is being pulled back toward the center of a conflict he does not yet understand. And Sohrab, without knowing it, is already walking toward the very man he has spent his life imagining. That decision would come back later. Because once Rostam answers the call, this stops being a war between kingdoms. It becomes something much worse. It becomes a meeting fate has been arranging since the night in Samangan. And now there is almost no space left between them. Chapter 6. The champion called back to battle. When the summons finally reached Rostam, it did not arrive with ceremony. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic urgency in the voice that carried it. Just a message, direct, familiar. The king needed him. Rostam had heard those words many times before. Too many times. He had been called to face monsters, to settle conflicts, to fix problems created by decisions he did not make. The weight of those expectations had followed him for years, and by now they no longer carried the same urgency they once had. So when Give stood before him and explained the situation, Rostam listened, but he did not react the way the court expected. There was a pause, a long one. He asked questions, but not with alarm. He wanted to know who this young commander was, where he had come from, what exactly he had done. And as the details were given, the fall of the White Fortress, the capture of Hojir, the growing fear among the Iranian forces, Rostam's expression did not sharpen with concern. If anything, it grew heavier, with something closer to irritation. This was not the first time a king had been unsettled by a rising threat, and Rostam had seen enough of these moments to recognize a pattern. A strong enemy appears, the court panics, and his name is called. Again. He did not refuse, but he did not rush either. And that delay matters, because in stories like this, timing is everything, and even a small hesitation can change the shape of what follows. Rostam remained where he was longer than he should have. He ate. He rested. He allowed the weight of the request to settle slowly, instead of responding immediately. Give watched this with growing unease, because he understood something Rostam chose to ignore. This was not a distant threat. This was already unfolding, already moving, already reshaping the borders of Iran. But Rostam had lived through too many wars to feel that urgency so easily. At one point, he spoke almost casually about his own life, about things far removed from the tension rising at the frontier. And in that moment, without realizing it, he mentioned something that now feels almost unbearable to hear. He spoke of the child he had left behind in Samangan. A son, still distant in his mind, still separate from the world of war. He spoke of him as if he existed somewhere outside all of this, untouched by conflict, still growing somewhere far from danger. That moment should not pass quickly, because the audience already understands what Rostam does not. The boy he imagines as distant is not distant at all. He is already at the edge of Iran, already leading an army, already shaping the war that Rostam is being asked to stop. He had no idea how close this had already become. Eventually, Rostam stood. He went because he had to, not because he understood what he was walking into. He would go. He would answer the call, because despite everything, despite the frustration, the repetition, the sense that he was being drawn into yet another conflict born from royal fear, This was still his land, and he would not allow it to fall. The journey back toward the Iranian court did not carry the weight it should have. That's what makes it so difficult to sit with. There was no sense in Rostam's mind that he was moving towards something personal. No instinct warning him. No hesitation beyond the usual reluctance of a man who has fought too many battles already. The land stretched out before him the same way it always had. Dust underfoot, wind moving across open ground, the quiet rhythm of travel that leaves space for thought. But none of those thoughts led him where they needed to go. When he reached the court of Kavus, the atmosphere shifted immediately. This was not a place at ease. There was tension in the air, visible in the way men stood, in the way voices dropped when Rostam entered, in the way attention moved toward him, not as a welcome, but as relief. Because to them, he was not just a warrior. He was the answer. Kavus spoke quickly, and there was no attempt to hide his concern. He described Sohrab in detail, his strength, his speed, the way experienced fighters had fallen before him, the way the fortress had been taken, the way fear was spreading among the ranks. Every word carried urgency, and beneath that urgency, something else. Doubt. Not in Rostam, but in everything else. Rostam listened. Calmly. Too calmly. And when he responded, there was a sharpness in his voice that revealed something deeper than confidence. He did not like being summoned like this. He did not like the way kings leaned on him when fear took hold. There was tension between them. Not open conflict, but something controlled, something familiar, something that had existed long before this moment. Because Rostam was not a servant, and he never let anyone forget that. But here's the part no one expected. Even in that tension, even with all the weight in the room, no one spoke the one name that could have changed everything. No one said that the young warrior might be connected to him. No one suggested that something about this situation felt unusual. Because no one knew. And the one person who might have sensed it did not. The conversation turned, as it always does, toward action. Rostam would go to the battlefield. He would face this young commander. He would stop the advance. It sounded simple when spoken aloud. That is another cruel detail in this story. Because the closer the truth comes, the simpler everything appears on the surface. Preparations began quickly. Armor was brought forward, fitted, checked. Weapons laid out, horses readied. The sound of the court shifted from anxious discussion to focused movement. Orders were given, messengers dispatched. Lines of communication opened and reinforced. And at the center of it all, Rostam. That night, before he left, there was a stillness that settled around him. Not the stillness of peace, the stillness of something about to begin. Somewhere far away, in another camp, beneath another sky, Sohrab was standing in a similar silence. Looking out across the land he was preparing to enter, thinking about the same question. The distance between them now was no longer measured in years or in unknown names. It was measured in miles, in hours, in decisions already made. And this is the moment that changes everything. Because from here on, there are no more delays that matter. No more choices that can pull this story back. Only movement. Only approach. Only the narrowing space between a father and a son who are about to meet, without knowing who they are. Chapter 7. The First Clash. A Strange Recognition. The battlefield did not erupt into chaos immediately. There was a pause before it all began. Two armies stood facing each other across open land, their lines drawn but unmoving. Standards lifted in the wind, armor catching the light, horses shifting under tension that had not yet been released. The air carried that quiet pressure that always comes before violence, when everyone present understands what is about to happen, but no one has moved yet. And at the center of that silence, two figures began to step forward. Sohrab did not hesitate. He had come here for this moment, even if he did not fully understand it. Every step he had taken, every decision that had brought him across borders and into conflict, had led him here. Facing the strongest champion of Iran was not just part of the war. It was part of something deeper he had been chasing without being able to name it. Across the field, Rostam approached more slowly, not out of fear, but out of habit. He had walked into too many battles to rush the beginning. His movements were measured, grounded, the movements of someone who understood exactly how quickly a fight could turn and how important it was to control the first moment. When they came within sight of each other, something shifted. It was not visible to the armies watching them. No one called it out. No one stepped forward to interrupt. But between them, in that narrowing space, there was a hesitation that did not belong in a normal battle. Sohrab saw a man who did not look like the others he had faced. There was no uncertainty in Rostam's posture, no excess movement, no display meant to intimidate. It was something quieter, heavier, more contained. The kind of presence that did not need to prove itself. And for a brief moment, something unsettled him. Rostam, in turn, studied the young warrior in front of him. He had been told this would be a formidable opponent, but what stood before him did not fit neatly into expectation. The strength was obvious, even before the fight began. It showed in the way Sohrab carried his armor, in the ease of his stance, in the absence of hesitation that usually reveals inexperience. But there was something else, something harder to place. A familiarity without context. They did not attack immediately. They spoke. And for a moment, it felt like this didn't have to turn into a fight. That detail matters, because this is one of the last spaces in the story where words still have the power to change what follows. Sohrab spoke first. His voice was steady, direct, without arrogance. He did not insult Rostam, did not try to provoke him into reckless anger. Instead, he asked a question, a simple one. Who are you? He didn't know why that question mattered so much, but it did. That question carries weight far beyond its simplicity. Because this is the moment where everything could have changed. If Rostam had answered honestly, if he had spoken his name, this story would end differently. But he did not. Rostam gave a false name, not with hesitation, but with intention. This was not an accident. It was not confusion. It was a choice shaped by pride, by caution, by the habits of a warrior who did not reveal himself easily to an unknown opponent. He had no reason, in his mind, to give the truth to a young enemy standing before him on a battlefield. And that decision would come back later. Sohrab listened, and something in him resisted the answer. It was not disbelief exactly. It was a sense that the truth had not been fully given. He pressed further. He spoke of Rostam, not directly, not accusingly, but with a kind of searching tone. He asked if the man before him knew the great champion of Iran, if he had seen him, if he stood somewhere behind the lines, waiting to enter the battle. There was something almost careful in the way he asked, as if he was testing a thought he did not yet trust. Rostam denied it, calmly, firmly. He dismissed the idea, stepping away from the name instead of toward it. And in doing so, he closed the only door that had been opened. But here's the part no one expected. Even after that denial, neither of them felt settled. And this is where it becomes difficult to watch. There was still something there, something unspoken, unresolved, pressing quietly beneath the surface of their words. Sohrab looked at him again, longer this time, trying to understand what he was sensing, trying to place it. But without the truth, there was nothing to hold on to. No clear connection, no confirmation. Only instinct. And instinct is easy to ignore when it does not match what you believe to be true. Because in Sohrab's mind, his father was somewhere else, somewhere greater, somewhere that would make itself known clearly when the time came. Not standing here, already in front of him, denying who he was. Rostam, too, pushed the feeling aside. He had faced countless warriors in his life. Strange instincts, moments of recognition, fleeting thoughts. These were not new to him. He had learned long ago not to let them interfere with action. And now, standing in front of an enemy who had already proven himself dangerous, he chose clarity over uncertainty. The fight would begin. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. Because once the first move is made, there is no returning to questions. They circled each other at first, slowly, each measuring the other's movement, watching for imbalance, testing distance without committing. The sound of armor shifting, the slight scrape of boots against the ground, the controlled breathing that comes before effort. All of it filled the silence that had replaced their conversation. Then the first clash came. It was immediate and heavy. No hesitation carried into it, no weakness. Steel met force with a sound that carried across the field, sharp enough to break the stillness that had held the armies in place. The watchers leaned forward, attention narrowing, because it was clear from the first exchange that this was not a simple contest. Sohrab moved with speed that did not match his size. Rostam responded with precision that did not waste energy. Each strike was answered. Each advance met resistance. And as the fight unfolded, something became clear to both of them. This would not end quickly. There is a moment in every battle where the shape of it reveals itself, where both fighters understand what they are facing. And in that moment, they both realized the same thing. They had not faced anyone like this before. What he didn't realize yet was that this was not just a battle between equals. It was something far more dangerous. The fight stretched on, long enough for doubt to return. Not doubt in their strength, but doubt in something deeper. Sohrab began to feel it again. That same quiet pull. Not strong enough to stop him, but strong enough to unsettle him. Rostam felt it too, briefly. A flicker of something he could not name. And like before, he ignored it, because the fight demanded focus. And focus leaves no room for questions. By the time they separated, neither had gained a clear advantage. The first clash had ended without resolution. But it had changed something. The space between them was no longer neutral. It was charged now, filled with something neither of them understood. And as they stepped back, preparing for what would come next, the one thing that could have stopped everything still remained unspoken. Chapter 8. The Second Duel. Pride before truth. The night between the two battles did not bring rest. It brought distance. Across the darkened field, the camps of Iran and Turan settled into uneasy silence. Fires burned low, casting shifting light across armor and canvas. Horses shifted in their tethers, occasionally breaking the stillness with a sharp breath or restless movement. Voices were quieter now, not because the danger had passed, but because it had become clearer. Everyone who had watched the first clash understood something had changed. This was not a normal fight. In the Turanian camp, Sohrab sat apart from the others. Not completely alone, but distant enough that no one disturbed him. The energy that had driven him forward until now had not faded, but it had changed shape. It was no longer just confidence or ambition. It carried something heavier, something that refused to settle even when the body grew still. He replayed the encounter in his mind. Not just the strikes, not just the movements, but the moments between them. The way the man had stood, the way he had answered, the way he had not answered. There was something in that exchange that refused to align with what Sohrab believed. He had imagined this meeting many times before, though he had never admitted it openly. In those thoughts, his father would be unmistakable. The recognition would be immediate. There would be no confusion, no doubt, no need to ask the same question twice. But that is not what had happened. Instead, he had stood before a man who felt familiar and denied it. That contradiction stayed with him, not sharp enough to stop him, but persistent enough to return again and again. He turned the thought over carefully. If this man were truly just another warrior, why did the name of Rostam seem to sit so heavily around him? Why did his presence feel different from the others Sohrab had faced? Why had the answer to such a simple question, "Who are you?" felt incomplete? But here's the part no one expected. Even with all of that doubt, Sohrab chose not to pursue it further. because another force was stronger. Pride. He had come too far to hesitate now. Too much had already been set in motion. Armies had marched. Fortresses had fallen. His name had spread across lands that once meant nothing to him. He was no longer just a young man searching for something lost. He had become the center of a war. And wars do not wait for uncertainty to resolve. So instead of holding on to that doubt, he set it aside. Across the field, Rostam's camp was quieter still. He did not sit with the others. He did not speak much. There was something about the first clash that had unsettled him as well, though not in a way he allowed himself to fully examine. He had faced countless opponents in his life, men stronger than most, faster than most, more desperate than most. But this had been different. Sohrab had not fought like someone trying to survive. He had fought like someone who expected to win. And more than that, he had fought like someone who belonged there. Rostam considered it briefly. The strength, the composure, the strange familiarity that had brushed against him during the fight. And then he pushed it away. Because instinct, when it cannot be explained, is easy to dismiss. And Rostam had built his life on certainty. What he didn't realize yet was that this was the last moment where doubt could have slowed him down. Morning came without relief. The light revealed the same field, the same armies, the same distance between them. But everything felt heavier now. Less like preparation, more like continuation. There was no long exchange this time, no careful circling of words. The space for that had already been used. When Sohrab stepped forward again, there was no question in his posture, no searching, no hesitation. Whatever uncertainty had touched him the night before had been sealed beneath something harder. Rostam met him the same way, grounded, controlled, but now fully committed. Sohrab's strength came in waves, building, pressing, forcing Rostam to respond rather than dictate the pace. It was not that Rostam was weaker. It was that Sohrab was rising into the fight in a way that made the outcome less certain than it had been the day before. There is a moment, brief but important, where Sohrab gains the advantage. He closes the distance, forces Rostam back, brings him to the ground. And in that moment, everything pauses again. Because Sohrab does not strike immediately. He looks at him, closer now than before, closer than any moment they have shared. And something returns, that same feeling, stronger now, harder to ignore. He could end it here, that much is clear. But instead, he hesitates. That hesitation is not weakness. It is instinct trying one last time to speak. That hesitation should have changed everything. It didn't. Because Rostam, bound by the rules he knows, speaks quickly. He tells Sohrab that this is not how such a fight ends. That a warrior of his standing does not kill an opponent in the first fall. That there is more to the contest, more to prove. Sohrab listens, and he accepts it. That decision matters more than it seems, because in that moment, he lets Rostam rise. And that decision would come back later. The fight continues. But something has shifted again. The brief opening, the moment where instinct could have changed everything, has passed. Now the duel moves toward its conclusion, not with hesitation, but with inevitability. Neither of them speaks of names anymore. Neither returns to the questions that once lingered between them. That space is gone now, replaced by something sharper, more final. And as they separate once more, preparing for what will come next, there is no longer any doubt about what is about to happen. They will meet again. One more time. And the next time, it will not end the same way. Chapter 9. The Fatal Strike. The third meeting did not feel like the first two. There was no curiosity left in it, no space for questions, only wait. The battlefield seemed quieter, even though nothing had changed. The same armies stood behind their champions. The same wind moved across the open ground. The same dust shifted beneath their feet. But now, everything carried a sense of finality, as if the land itself understood that whatever happened next would not be undone. Sohrab stepped forward first again, but this time there was no searching in his expression, no hesitation carried over from the night before. Whatever doubt had touched him had been buried beneath something stronger. Rostam followed. His movements were steady, controlled, but heavier now. Not physically. Something else. Something harder to name. They stood facing each other once more, closer than before. Familiar in a way that no longer felt strange, only unavoidable. There were no questions this time, no testing of identity, no mention of names. That part of the story had passed. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. Because without questions, there is nothing left to delay what comes next. The fight began immediately. No circling, no slow adjustment, just impact. The sound of the first strike carried across the field, sharper than before, final in a way the earlier clashes had not been. There was no testing now. Both moved with full intention, each knowing that this encounter would not end the way the others had. Sohrab pressed forward again, just as he had before, but now there was something more controlled in his movement, less urgency, more precision. He had learned from the earlier encounters, adapted, refined his approach. He was not just strong, he was evolving. Rostam met him with the same discipline that had carried him through countless battles. But this time, he could feel the difference more clearly. This was not a fight he could prolong, not safely. There is a shift that happens in a battle, when both fighters understand that endurance will not decide the outcome, when the fight must be resolved. And both of them felt it. Steel clashed again and again, each exchange heavier than the last. The rhythm of the fight became tighter, faster, less forgiving. There were no wasted movements now, no space to recover fully between strikes. Sohrab pushed harder, closing distance, forcing engagement, trying to end it. And for a brief moment, it almost worked. He drove forward with enough force to break Rostam's balance, forcing him back again, pressing him toward the edge of control. And in that moment, something familiar returned. Not hesitation, recognition. It wasn't clear, not enough to stop him, but enough to flicker through his thoughts again. Why does this feel known? But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because the fight did not allow space for it. Rostam recovered, and when he did, something changed. There are moments in the lives of great warriors where instinct takes over completely, where experience, survival, and the need to end the fight override everything else. This was one of those moments. He adjusted his approach, not visibly at first, but in intention. He stopped reacting and began directing. The next exchange came faster, sharper, more deliberate. Sohrab stepped in again, expecting to continue the pressure he had built, but this time, the response was different. Rostam created an opening, a small one, just enough, and Sohrab moved into it. It happened in a way that almost didn't look important, until it was. It did not look like much from a distance. No dramatic pause, no warning, just a shift, a decision, a strike. And this is the moment that changes everything. Rostam drove forward with precision, the kind that comes from years of ending battles quickly and decisively when the opportunity appears. There was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, no second thought. The strike landed. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then Sohrab stopped. The movement left his body in stages. First the forward momentum, then the resistance, then the strength that had defined him from the beginning. He staggered. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, as if his body was trying to understand what had just happened. The battlefield grew quiet again. Not in sound, but in focus, because everyone watching could see it. This was not like before. Sohrab dropped to one knee, then steadied himself, trying to hold on to the strength that had never failed him until now. But it was already too late. What he didn't realize yet was that the question he had carried his entire life was about to be answered. Rostam stepped back slightly, not in fear, but in recognition of the outcome. He had done what he had always done, found the opening, ended the fight. But something did not feel like victory. Sohrab looked up at him, not with anger, not with shock, but with something else entirely. Understanding. Not of what had happened, but of what was coming. Because in that moment, as the strength began to leave him, the need to know, the question that had followed him since childhood, rose again, stronger than before. And now, for the first time, he would not let it go unanswered. Chapter 10. The Truth That Came Too Late. The battlefield did not move the way it had before. Even though the armies were still there, even though the wind still passed over the ground and armor still shifted in place, everything felt distant now, as if the world itself had stepped back from what was happening between the two of them. Because the fight was over. But something else had just begun. Sohrab remained where he had fallen. His strength, which had carried him through every moment of his life until now, was leaving him, slowly, Not all at once, but in a way that made him aware of it. Each breath came heavier than the last. Each movement required more effort than it should have. And yet, his mind was clear. Clearer than it had ever been. Rostam stood a short distance away, watching. There was no celebration in him, no sense of victory, only a strange stillness, as if something in him had not yet caught up to what had just happened. Sohrab lifted his head slightly, not easily, but with intention. He looked at the man standing before him, not as an enemy now, but as something else. And when he spoke, his voice was not filled with anger. It carried something quieter, something that had been waiting for this moment. He said that his mother had told him of a man, a warrior unlike any other, a man whose strength was known across the world, a man he had spent his life trying to find. Rostam did not react immediately. The words settled slowly. Sohrab continued. He spoke of how he had come to this land not simply for conquest, but because he believed that somewhere within Iran he would find that man. That if he rose high enough, if he forced the world to respond to him, the truth would reveal itself. That is the moment where the story shifts from battle to tragedy. Because Rostam begins to listen differently. There is a subtle change in him, a stillness that deepens, a focus that sharpens. Sohrab speaks again. He says that his mother had given him something, a sign, proof of who his father was. Something to carry with him. Something that would confirm the truth when the time came. Rostam takes a step closer. Slowly. Not because he understands yet, but because something in what he is hearing refuses to stay distant. And this is where everything starts to fall apart. Sohrab, with what strength remains, reaches for it. Not quickly, not easily, but deliberately. He brings forward the token, the same one, the seal that had been given years ago in Samangan. For a moment, Rostam does not react. Not because he does not recognize it, but because recognition does not arrive all at once. It comes in pieces. The memory, the night, the decision, the child he had spoken of as distant. At first, it didn't make sense. Then the memory returned. And then it stopped being a possibility. And this is the part that breaks the story completely. Even in that moment, Rostam does not want to believe it. Because belief would mean accepting something that cannot be undone. He looks closer. His expression shifts. Not sharply, but in a way that feels heavier than anything that has come before. And then it settles. The truth. The strongest man in the world realizes what he has done. There is no denial left, no uncertainty, no space to question it. The young warrior before him is his son. The silence that follows is different from any other silence in the story. It is not the pause before action, not the stillness of tension. It is the absence of anything that can fix what has happened. Rostam moves closer now, faster than before, not with control, but with urgency. He kneels beside him, calls for help, for healers, for anything that might still change the outcome. But deep down, he already knows. Sohrab watches him, and in that moment, something becomes clear to him as well. Not just the identity of the man before him, but the truth of what has just happened. The one person he had been searching for, the one person he had imagined meeting, not as an enemy, but as something else entirely, was the one who had brought him here. There is no anger in him. That is what makes it heavier. Only a kind of quiet acceptance. He speaks again, not to accuse, not to blame, but to acknowledge. He tells Rostam that he had hoped to find him, that he had believed somehow they would stand together, that the world would shift around them, not break between them. And now, that possibility is gone. What he didn't realize yet was that this was the only moment in the entire story where the truth is complete. And it changes nothing. Because there is no reversal, no second chance, no way to return to the moment before the name was hidden, before the question was unanswered, before the strike was made. Rostam continues calling for help, demanding it, as if force alone could undo what force has already done. But the world does not respond. The battlefield remains. The armies remain. The silence remains. And in that silence, the truth settles fully. Not just who they are to each other, but what that means. This was never just a battle. It was a meeting delayed too long, a truth held back too carefully, a question that stayed unanswered until answering it no longer mattered. And now, there is nothing left to prevent what comes next. Chapter 11. A Father's Grief. The battlefield did not return to normal after the truth was spoken. It did not erupt back into movement. It did not shift into celebration or even clear defeat. Instead, everything seemed to hold its distance, as if the land itself understood that what had happened here did not belong to war anymore. Rostam remained beside Sohrab, not as a champion, not as a warrior, but as something far more fragile. He called again for help, not once, not calmly, but repeatedly, with a force that felt closer to desperation than command. He demanded healers, remedies, anything that might still hold back what was already happening. His voice carried across the field, cutting through the stillness, but it no longer held authority in the same way it once had. Because this was not something strength could command. Men moved, messengers ran, orders were passed from one voice to another. But beneath all of that movement, there was an understanding. This could not be undone. Sohrab lay where he had fallen, the strength that had defined him from the beginning now fading in a way that could not be reversed. His breathing slowed, uneven, but steady enough to hold him in the moment. He was still present, still aware, still able to see the man beside him not as an enemy, but as something far more complex. Rostam leaned closer, not carefully, not with a control that had defined him in battle, but with urgency that bordered on panic. He spoke, not as a warrior, as a father who had only just realized what that meant. He told Sohrab to hold on, to remain, to wait for help, as if time itself could be forced to stop if he spoke strongly enough. But here's the part no one expected. Even now, even in this moment where the truth was fully revealed, Rostam still tried to fight what could not be fought. Because that is all he had ever known. There are men who accept loss, and there are men who resist it until there is nothing left to resist with. Rostam had never learned how to do the first. He called for a remedy that might save him, a cure that could be brought from the king, something rare, something powerful enough to pull Sohrab back from the edge he had already reached. Messengers were sent again, this time not for strategy or war, but for survival. But even as those orders were given, something deeper had already settled in, because Rostam understood the nature of wounds. He understood the difference between injury and finality. He had seen it before, in others. He had never expected to see it here. Sohrab watched him, quietly. There was no accusation in his gaze, no bitterness, no anger, only a kind of clarity. He spoke again, but this time his words carried a different weight. Not searching, not questioning, but closing. He told Rostam that what had happened could not be changed, that the path had already been walked, that what remained now was not to fight against it, but to understand it. Rostam did not want to hear that. He spoke over him, rejected it, refused to accept that this moment could not be extended, could not be reshaped, could not be forced into something else. Nothing needed to unfold anymore. It had already happened into something heavier than grief. Because grief, at its core, is recognition. And Rostam was only just beginning to recognize the full weight of what had been lost. Not just a son, but every moment that should have come before this one. The years that had passed without knowledge. The questions that had gone unanswered. The meeting that should have been something entirely different. All of it. Gone. Not gradually, but all at once. He understood it now. Fully. Was that this was not just the loss of a son, it was the collapse of everything that could have been. Sohrab's strength continued to fade. Not suddenly, but steadily. There is a quiet cruelty in that kind of ending, because it allows time. Time to understand. Time to feel. Time to see clearly what cannot be changed. Rostam stayed beside him. He did not move away. He did not return to the army. He did not speak to the others. Nothing else existed now, and as the moment stretched, the weight of silence became heavier than any battle he had ever fought. Because there was no enemy here. No opponent. No force to resist. Only consequence. Sohrab's breathing slowed further, each breath more distant than the last. And Rostam, for all his strength, for all the battles he had survived, for all the enemies he had overcome, could do nothing. That is the true center of this chapter, not the moment of death, but the realization that nothing remains to be done. And this is the moment that changes everything. Because from here on, Rostam is no longer just the hero of victories. He becomes something else. A man who carries a single moment for the rest of his life. One decision, one withheld truth, one strike, and the knowledge that none of it can be undone. Chapter 12. The Funeral of Sohrab. The battlefield did not return to war. It remained quiet. Not empty, not abandoned, but quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if both sides understood that what had taken place between Rostam and Sohrab had moved beyond conflict. The armies still stood in their places, but no one stepped forward. No orders were shouted. No movement broke the space that had formed around the fallen warrior. Because this was no longer a moment that belonged to either side. Sohrab's body was lifted carefully, not as an enemy, not as a fallen opponent, but as something that demanded respect. Men who had come to fight him now carried him, slowly, without urgency, each step measured, each movement controlled, as if any sudden motion would disturb something that had not yet fully settled. Rostam walked beside them. He did not lead. He did not speak. There was nothing left for him to command. The path away from the battlefield felt longer than it should have. The ground unchanged, the air the same, but every step carried a weight that had not been there before. The sounds of armor and movement, once sharp and purposeful, were now muted, almost distant, as if the world itself had lowered its voice. They reached the place where the burial would be prepared. The earth had already been chosen, not hastily, but with care. Sohrab was laid down with the respect given to a warrior, his place in the world acknowledged even in death. There was no attempt to diminish what he had been, no effort to erase his strength or his presence. Even those who had stood against him understood that what had been lost here was not simple. And this is where everything becomes still. There are moments in stories where silence carries more than words ever could. This was one of them. Rostam stood over him, not as a figure of legend, not as the hero spoken of in distant lands, but as a man who had arrived too late to understand what mattered. He did not speak immediately. There were no dramatic words, no declarations meant to carry across the gathered men. Only a long pause. Because what could be said here that would matter? The truth had already been revealed. The loss had already been made complete. And yet, something had to be acknowledged. When Rostam finally spoke, his voice did not carry the force it once had. It did not rise above the moment. It remained within it. He called Sohrab his son. The one word that should have come years earlier. Not loudly, not for others to hear, but because it needed to be said at least once in a way that could not be taken back. But here's the part no one expected. That acknowledgement, the one thing Sohrab had searched for his entire life, came at the only moment where it could no longer change anything. that is the weight of this story. The rites continued, measured, respectful, unhurried. There was no rush to return to war, no urgency to move on. Even those who had been enemies stood within the same stillness, because the scale of what had happened had reshaped the meaning of the conflict itself. This was not just the burial of a warrior, it was the closing of something that should have begun differently. Rostam remained there, long after the necessary acts had been completed, long after others had begun to step back, to return to their roles, to prepare for whatever would come next. He did not move, because leaving would mean accepting that this moment was finished, and there was nothing in him that was ready to do that. What he didn't realize yet was that this moment would never truly end for him. It would follow him, not as a memory that fades, but as something fixed, unchanging. A single point in time that everything before it would lead toward, and everything after it would carry. The battlefield would move again. The war would continue. Names would be spoken, victories would be claimed, losses would be counted. But none of it would exist in the same way, because at the center of it all, there would always be this. A father, a son, a meeting that came too late. And this is the moment that settles the story into its final shape, not with resolution, but with understanding. That some tragedies are not built on great battles or powerful enemies, but on silence, on delay, on a single truth held back just long enough to become irreversible. Chapter 13. Epilogue. The tragedy that never ends. If you go back to the beginning of this story, it does not start with war. It does not start with hatred, or betrayal, or even conflict. It starts quietly, with a meeting, a decision, a truth that was not spoken fully. And if you follow that thread all the way through, every moment that came after begins to make a different kind of sense. This was never a story about a single battle. It was a story about delay, about silence, about how something small, something that feels harmless at the time, can continue forward, untouched, until it reaches a moment where it can no longer be changed. The question that followed this story from the very beginning was simple. Will father and son recognize each other before it's too late? And by the time the answer comes, it doesn't help anymore. Not because they were destined to fight, but because every chance to stop it was missed. That is what makes this story stay. Not the scale of the battle, not the strength of the warriors, but the moments where something could have been different. When Tamineh chose not to speak the name. When Sohrab accepted that silence and turned it into purpose. When Rostam stood before his opponent and chose not to reveal who he was. None of those decisions felt final at the time. None of them seemed like the point where everything would break. But here's the part no one expected. They were. Because tragedy rarely announces itself. It builds quietly, step by step, choice by choice. And by the time it becomes visible, it is already complete. This is why the story does not feel distant. Even though it comes from the Shahnameh, written centuries ago by Ferdowsi, it does not stay in the past. It repeats. You see it in other stories, in different forms. In Star Wars, Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, where truth is revealed only after the damage has already been done, and the weight of that knowledge reshapes everything that follows. In Oedipus Rex, where the search for truth leads not to resolution, but to a realization that comes too late to prevent the outcome. The details change, the names change, the settings shift, but the pattern remains. A truth withheld, a question delayed, a moment of recognition that arrives just after it is needed. And this is where the story returns to where it began, to that quiet night in Samangan, to the decision that felt contained within a single moment, to the belief that something could be left unspoken and still remain harmless. Because now, standing at the end of the story, it becomes clear. Nothing in this story was truly separate. The battlefield, the silence, the unanswered question, the final strike. All of it was connected. All of it was moving toward the same point. And once that point was reached, there was no way back. What he didn't realize yet, what none of them realized, was that recognition alone is not enough. It has to come in time. And when it doesn't, it becomes something else. Not reunion, not understanding, but regret. The kind that does not fade. The kind that stays. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, you already understand something most people miss about myths like this. They are not just about what happened. They are about what almost happened. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more deep myth retellings like this. And I want to ask you something before you go. Do you think this could have been avoided? Or do you think, from the very first moment, it was always going to end this way? Because that question is the only part of this story that never really ends. Thank you for listening. Yours, Lady Mythos.